Well, my name is Jason Smart. I moved to Kyiv back in 2015, but have been routinely coming to Ukraine since about 2005 or so. And so I've been here for a long time in Ukraine. I initially came here per the invitation directed to the SBU to work on anti-corruption initiatives and to oppose Russian influence in the country and in the region. And today, I continue the work to try to support Ukraine.
What first motivated you, a foreign advisor and political strategist, to focus your career on Ukraine and post-Soviet space?
Well, I was studying it when I was in high school. I was actually made a decision to study Russian, and it was a decision because I was forced out of a different class and there was no space anywhere else. So I studied Russian, did well in that, did well in college doing Russian as well. I was a national security scholar in Russia. Then I worked for an organization that was chaired by John McCain, working to promote democracy in other countries. So I lived in Kyrgyzstan for 4 years. I lived in Moldova for 3 years. I worked also with Ukraine. I was working in Kazakhstan, and I was thrown out of Russia during that period of time for working with the democratic opposition to the Putin regime. That's back in 2009. But I started working with the Russian opposition studying back in 2006 or so. So it's something that I've just been spending a lot of time on for the past couple of decades.
You were reportedly banned for life by the Russian government back in 2010 because of your support for Russia's democratic opposition. How has that shaped your worldview and reporting today?
Well, I think the reality is that I was committed to the cause of the democracy promotion abroad. And at that point in time, there was a lot more hope for Russia. Today, it's become sort of hopeless. But back then, there was definitely a sense that things could one day improve, that it become a normal country. And it chose not to go down that path. The Putin dictatorship has only worsened. That being all said, I think in the end, truth will win. And in this case, I believe that Ukraine will win and Russia will lose.
What are the biggest challenges, I'm talking personal and professional, that you faced working from Ukraine since the full-scale invasion started?
Frankly, I think the biggest setback or the hardest part is simply transport. Getting in and out of the country has become so much more difficult. Whenever I go to the States, it's a couple of days or a few days to get over there, a few days to get back. And very often for work, I do travel abroad. And the fact that I am regularly flying to the Americas, both North and South, as well as to other countries, it's just physically very difficult to get to and from Ukraine. And that's been quite delimitating. But at the same time, I think that the day-to-day setbacks that we face, things like the power outages and things like water being cut for periods of time or not having heating, it's the price to pay for freedom. And so it's something that you endure. And I think the way that you should look at it, or the way at least I look at it, is sort of with the Stoic principle that we can't change this, what happens externally, but we choose what we see or how we feel. And so it is through one's own decision as to whether or not it's going to be a good day or a bad day. So you can be there in the dark and be cold and still be happy if you choose to be.
Absolutely. So switching to our European shenanigans, recently Bart De Wever, Prime Minister of Belgium, stated that Russia is not losing the war and argued that frozen Russian assets should eventually be returned to Russia once the war ends. And at the same time, he warned that moving to seize them would be legally and politically dangerous. How do you assess his stance, and what risks does this position send to Ukraine and to European unity?
So I think we have to understand the various views of what's going on with this money and why it's so important. So one part is that Euroclear itself has said, its CEO, that there would be a serious risk to Euroclear's reputation and as well to the European financial system if it were to seize assets and use them on something. Now, there is probably, some risk in that. I don't think it's a huge risk. But there's also the aspect here that Belgium is making over $1 billion a year in just the taxes that are paid from these frozen assets that are parked in Brussels. But the other fear that you hear a lot with different European leaders is the legal mechanisms for this are not entirely clear. So if they seize this money, let's imagine, and 10 years from now, Russia sues and says that was not licit, who's going to pay for that? Who's going to pay for this fines or the interest that was collected, that should have been collected in this period of time, the damage done? Brussels, that is the Belgians, are very worried about the fact that they might be the ones stuck with this, that they would be left, to pay this cost, and the rest of the countries of Europe just to leave them out in the cold. So it is a little bit of a complex issue. That being said, in my view, it's very clearly sort of like having a fire in a house. You have to worry about putting out that fire first. That's what's going on here in Ukraine. And later on, we'll figure out who owned the hose or didn't own the hose. But right now, what is happening in Ukraine is something that will spread to Europe, and it'll be far more expensive than whatever cost might come from having used this money, which if Europe has a legal right to freeze, it also has a legal right to use.
Do you think De Wever's argument that using these frozen Russian assets could hinder a future peace deal is reasonable, or is it effectively letting Russia off the hook and undermining Ukraine?
I think it is letting Russia off the hook. I think that we've seen over the course of the past 3.5 years, almost 4 years now, that routinely people have said that this something would provoke Russia, or this would be an escalation. And the result of that has been just slower assistance. It eventually comes, it just slows down the pace of the assistance, which works to the disadvantage of Ukraine. So ultimately, unfortunately, I think that what we are seeing right now are things that, even if they're truly held and believed ideas of these people, the fact is that they're not doing a favor to their own states, they're not doing a favor to Ukraine, obviously. They're operating in the interest of Russia, though I don't think they think of it that way. I certainly don't think that they're pro-Russian. I think that they don't just realize what the actual effect of their decisions will be.
Recently, there have been reports that Italy is withdrawing from the PURL support program for Ukraine and shifting to mostly diplomatic support. In your view, what might be driving Italy's change of position?
I think the reality of the fact is that within Italy, there's a lot of populist politics. I think it's probably bending ultimately to what's going on domestically in the country, which is typically the case. When you look at any foreign policy that a country comes out with, the leaders are ultimately making decisions that best reflect what they think will be beneficial to them for their domestic needs. So today, I think it's probably really just a reflection of that. At the same time, I think that they're probably trying to get more aligned with what the White House is doing.
Could influence from foreign political leaders, for instance, Donald Trump or Russia's supporters in his team, play a role in shaping Italy's or other countries' policy towards Ukraine?
Well, I think that Italy certainly is seeking to be aligned with what the White House is doing, and they might perceive these sorts of decisions as being something that would make the White House happy. A lot of countries in the world, not just Italy, are very uncertain about what the White House is planning to do in the future and how to be better in touch with them or better aligned with them. And so this could very well reflect that policy decision-making.
There's also a recent statement from Finland indicating that they will not provide new security guarantees for Ukraine. What message does that send to Kyiv, to Russia, and to other European capitals? And what do you think is behind Finland's decision?
Finland, as far as I can understand, has obviously left the stage of where it was before, where it was very isolated from everything. It's now a NATO member. At the same time, they do have a historic fear of more conflict with Russia. It's, by the way, one more great example of a smaller country beating Russia at warfare. But either way, they don't want to repeat that. And so today I think that they might view it as an escalation to do more. They're trying to keep this war as far away from their borders as possible. And I think that's probably what motivates this. Keep in mind, it's all about domestic politics. I'm not quite familiar with what is going on domestically in Finnish politics, but undoubtedly there is something like this going on right now where somebody sees an opportunity to push away from going all out and supporting Ukraine because they think it will help them politically back in Helsinki. So I assume that is a similar case that we see today.
Generally speaking, all those countries that are stepping back or seemingly stepping back from supporting Ukraine, as we can see today, does this indicate some kind of global shift in the international agenda regarding Ukraine? How do you think?
Well, overall, there has been a shift, that's for sure. And support has waned over this period of time. We see that in the European countries very clearly. We see that in the United States very clearly. At the same time, I don't think that it really shows a lack of support for Ukraine. It shows a lack of decision-making about what the future will look like. Right now, those who understand that Ukraine's fight is something that will have effects on all of us understand why it's so important to support Ukraine today. But those who don't appreciate that, or those politicians who just realize it's populist to take advantage of this and say, why are we spending money in Ukraine when we have potholes in our own country, we have problems here that we have to resolve, why are we worrying about them, let's worry about us first. That's something that just is the nature of politics. It's not unusual or surprising. So I don't think that it's really a sign that people are turning away from Ukraine. It's certainly not a sign that they're turning towards Russia, but it is the inevitability that comes with democratic processes. And historically, if you look at that, the Soviet Union understood that very well. Their diplomats, and you look at our bilateral relations with the United States, or multilateral relations that they had, for instance, in the UN, and you would see that they were very patient about things. They understood that there is always elections upcoming, there's a press cycle that's coming, and that the Western politicians have to respond to this in a way that's in their interest, and so they need quick results. But Russia, because it's not a democratic society, can afford for this to drag out for long, long periods of time. And that's typically what they try to do. So I think in this case, it is very similar here. These things all play into Russia's hands on one side because simply other countries, time goes on, there's other problems that arrive, and Ukraine is no longer the top issue of the day. So this is something that Russia does count on, though, when it's trying to calculate what will come next in its foreign policy.
Do you think there is a point beyond which decreasing European support poses an existential risk to Ukraine's ability to defend itself? Or do you think Ukraine can adapt and survive even with reduced European backing?
Well, Ukraine at this point can continue with reduced European backing, but the amount of support that Ukraine needs is quite significant. And that's why I think it's so important what happens with these frozen funds. As I said, it's not wholly irrational for a politician to be concerned about using them. The ones that are in Europe, I should say. The ones in the United States actually could be used much easier, much quicker, but that's not really happening. And that's because there is a historic precedent in the United States of doing that. We did it with Iran, and we've done it before. So there is a way to do this. We did it in World War II as well, as far as I recall. So since there is a historic precedent, we don't even have to have a law passed. It's just executive order, and they can be seized. In the case of the European Union, seeking out consensus for something as complex as this is much more challenging. So looking ahead, it would seem that it is going to be probably one of the most decisive moments to see whether or not they're going to use this money or not. Because if they use this money, I think it becomes far, far easier for Ukraine going ahead.
Given what you see now, what are the most likely trajectories for European support over the next 6, 12 months? And are we already on a downward side, or could events militarily, politically, or economically trigger renewed solidarity among the European nations?
Well, definitely it can come back. I mean, these things do come and go. They fade and they rise. So it doesn't surprise me right now that, it's going through one of these cycles. But it's not the sign that things are going to fundamentally change. I think that there is enough understanding in Europe with senior leaders about what this war means, why it's so important, and what needs to be done. Now, going ahead, it will be an ongoing fight. We'll have to keep people on our side, keep people convinced that this is important, and that they understand truly the value that comes from this. This is not just doing a favor. This is something that's operating their own national security interests. And so if you're operating your own national security interests, you have to describe that to your population correctly as to exactly what this is. That this is not just a handout, this is not just a gift, this is something that will directly assist them in the future and prevent their own sons from having to go fight in a war.
If you had to advise European governments, especially those wavering, what would be the moral and strategic case for sustaining robust support for Ukraine?
Well, very clearly the war in Ukraine is part of something systemic, and I think a lot of people miss globally, not just in Europe, but truly globally, leaders don't appreciate the amount of influence that Russia has in their country as well. And I said a small example is we look at how Russia is very, very involved with other organizations that are blacklisted or sanctioned. For instance, they work with the countries like Iran and North Korea. That's a well-known fact. But you look at countries that don't want to help Ukraine right now, such as South Korea, they don't appreciate the fact that it's North Korea that is currently doing a lot to support this war effort. So they could actually be helping their own selves by supporting Ukraine more. But there's also the non-governmental organizations, the non-state actors, the NSAs. And those include things like Hezbollah. They include things like the drug cartels. These organizations work together, actually in Latin America largely, in order to work with Russia as well. And the reason that they all work together is very simple. They're all part of this group of entities that cannot access normal banking, they cannot access normal financial institutions, and so because of that, they operate together to wash money, to transport weapons, and ultimately these are things that Russia is probably the chief organizer in the world is with this. So when we look at something in the United States that really upsets the political system, such as illegal immigration, or narcotics, or crime, there's Russian fingerprints here because they're involved in all of these things. So today, going ahead, I think that it's the most important thing that people need to understand, these leaders, including Europe, is that Russia is directly seeking to destabilize their societies, even if they don't appreciate it.
What should Ukrainian leaders and also Western supporters be doing now to avoid losing this critical support, both politically and materially?
Right now, I think that it's very important for the Ukrainian leadership to make sure that the world understands what's occurring. And they understand truly the links of how this all ties to what they see in their own countries. That's routinely what we have struggled with. Routinely what we have a problem with is that many people think this is a regional issue. This is Ukraine and Russia. It's about a border and where the borders are going to be. But it's really not about that. I mean, it's never been about that. And I've argued before that ultimately this war was truly never really directly about Ukraine. It's part of a global war. This is a battlefield, but it's one of the battlefields. Russia is engaged in a global war, and that's what it's doing today when it supports non-state actors like Hezbollah that carry out terrorist attacks. That's what happens when it supports Nicolas Maduro and his regime. This is what happens when they have the regime in Nicaragua. This is what we see when they overthrew the governments in Burkina Faso or Mali or Niger, which were all overthrown by the Russian regime. So when they are engaged in this, it's not because Burkina Faso is the center of the world. Burkina Faso is simply a battlefield for them. And when it denies Vladimir Putin, he's engaging in a global war. Vladimir Putin, remember, very seriously believes that we're engaged already in World War IV. World War III came during the Cold War, something that he believes the Soviet Union ultimately lost, which it did because it collapsed. But the way that you win a global war is something you learn in the Cold War. Hot wars like we saw in World War II, where you have huge navies attacking each other at sea, that's really expensive. It's really hard to do for a long time. And there's a huge risk that you could actually lose. But if you engage in something like a hybrid war that we see today globally, that's much more interesting and something that Russia can actually win at. So globally, Russia is engaged across the world and has amazing influence with this. And that's because it knows that avoiding direct military confrontation like it has now in Ukraine is what it wants globally. Ukraine, I very sincerely do not believe Putin had planned for this to be a 4-year operation where he's not taking Kyiv, but is still talking about Pokrovsk for how many months now. I don't think that was the objective. His objective was this was going to be a special operation, as he would have called it, where you take Kyiv, you replace the leadership, and you put someone in, and they get out. But to just be here forever like this, and this capacity being destroyed, certainly not was the objective. It's simply, it turned out terribly for them. Vladimir Putin believes he is engaged in a war with the West, and that is pretty accurate, because all of his allies are actively fighting against the West, and it's not for ideology necessarily. Some of them are, but I think that another reason is that simply it's like cops and robbers. They're engaged in illicit crimes. Look at the Assad regime, for instance, in Syria. You know, it made a significant amount of money from the illegal trade of drugs, narcotics. It was directly involved in narcotics trade. So I don't think people appreciate the fact that Russia and these others, of course they don't like the police, which would be, normal countries, NATO countries, that actually enforce laws, because that makes it much harder for you to make money.
What would you say is the cheapest, easiest, and probably most reliable way to make Russia collapse as soon as possible?
Absolutely, without the slightest amount of doubt in my mind, it is to attack their economy. I've argued for 3.5 years that the greatest investment that we can do right now is to significantly damage the Russian economy, which there's a lot of different ways that can be done. And unfortunately, a lot of people don't appreciate that, I think, before, but now it's become more clear. Wars only end due to one of 3 reasons. It's going to have a political reason, an economic reason, or a military reason. Physically ejecting the Russians from Ukraine 100% and making sure they would never return, it's very, very difficult. Much easier is if you make their economy collapse and then they can't defend their lines anymore, or they just quit. Remember World War I, how it worked out for the Russian Empire. It worked out very well. It worked out with mass desertion. So I think the same sort of thing could happen here. If there starts to be a significant political turmoil or economic turmoil within Russia, like in World War I, where, eventually then Trotsky came, but that's a different story. But in this case, if the economy were to collapse within Russia, or we saw something like hyperinflation, like a situation like 1998 or worse, when the ruble collapsed, that very rapidly could end the war within days. It's not an exaggeration. Days. That is not something that is totally bonkers. That's not something that's crazy. That's realistic. It can really happen. And that's why many people try to understand, why is the U.S. only now putting sanctions on Lukoil and others? Well, you have to understand, there is that would not collapse the Russian economy immediately. But there was a fear, 3 years ago, that it would. That would actually cause the collapse. But also it would punish our partners, and that was something they're trying to avoid. But either way, the collapse of the Russian economy is the best thing that we can aim for today. And the way that you could do that would be severalfold. And the ways outside of sanctions and sanction enforcement, all these things which are very important, very good. The other way that you go after that, though, is to make sure that Vladimir Putin himself understands that he personally, on a personal level, is at risk for losing his regime. That's the only thing he cares about. There's no dictator in the world who cares about his own people or his own country. That's why he chose to make himself the leader. He doesn't care what anyone else thinks. That's how you become the dictator. You don't care about your country. And so in this case, he very clearly doesn't care about his country. He wants to be in power. And he doesn't want to end up like Gaddafi or like Mussolini. So if you want to avoid that, what you do is you make sure your country is stable. But if you have a rapidly destabilized situation, like he felt was probably happening when Prigozhin had his uprising back in Rostov, that's something that can actually change the dynamic. And within dictatorships themselves, it has been shown before that when something like this happens, rapid economic destabilization, dictatorships very often fall. And there's a very logical reason, outside of just the natural tendency that things fall. It's that those around them realize that the dictator doesn't have all the answers. He doesn't have all the power. And those that realize they've wanted to be the dictator for a long time, this is their moment of opportunity to strike and to take the power from them.
And finally, there's a lot of different opinions coming from people who are afraid to see the collapse of the Russian terrorist regime. Can you explain why is it beneficial for us, for civilized world, to see the collapse of the Russian Federation?
Russia today is engaged in evil globally. I mean that both legally and morally. It's engaged across the world in efforts to change the way that we live in a negative sense. They have no interest in seeing a world where there's not war. They have an interest in seeing destabilized situations across the world. And that's why when they talk about things such as a new global order or multipolar world, it's really not about that. You have to understand exactly what they mean. They mean breaking down the superpower and breaking down its allies so that Russia can do what it wants to do. And so Russia is engaged globally in a lot of different efforts to subvert democracies and subvert our way of life. Now, very unfortunately, people don't appreciate that every single day. Russia is actively, not just in propaganda, but also in hacking, in espionage, in sabotage, engaged in efforts to destabilize the West. And we continue to give them a pass, which is why, once again, they believe that they're probably winning World War IV in their own eyes, is because they realize they're fighting war and we're not even aware of it. We think so foolishly that by avoiding assisting Ukraine right now, they will then not attack the West. But what do you call the rest of the attacks that they're carrying out? What do you call it sabotage? What do you call the fact that they put bombs on airplanes? What would we refer to that as? They are currently engaged in war, but they make sure that they do it at just the right level where it most likely will not trigger Article 5, which is the last thing that they need right now. It's better to have these sorts of wars, these sorts of fighting, where we just sort of brush it off and we give them a pass, and they continue to wage war against us, and we refuse to admit that fact.